This is a population density map of Utah. Looking at it, you'll notice that almost everyone is in this narrow stretch of land. It's known as the Wasatch Front, and it holds an insane 80% of Utah's entire population. Much of the rest of the state is barely inhabited. As for why? Well, to answer that, we have to start by tracing the history of Utah, or should I say, the history of the Mormons. In 1823, a 17-year-old boy named Joseph Smith had a vision. He was visited by an angel named Moroni, who told him the location of some golden plates, which, according to the Mormon faith, he found near his home in Palmyra, New York. The plates revealed that an ancient group of people had moved to North America from Israel around 600 BC, and then split into two groups, the Lamanites, who'd fallen away from God, and the Nephites, who'd stayed faithful to God. After Jesus was resurrected, it's said he came over to North America to teach the Nephites and perform miracles and establish a church. I don't want to get too much into Mormon theology, but just keep that Nephite-Lamanite distinction in mind for later. It'll come up again. Anyway, Smith built a following and moved west, looking for a good place to establish what he called the City of Zion. He had a plan for his city. It would be a self-sufficient, agrarian model where every family would get half an acre on which to build a house and plant a garden, plus a square mile of land surrounding the city full of barns and farmland. Smith and the Mormons tried this model out in a few places, including Kirkland, Ohio, and parts of Missouri, before eventually founding a settlement in Nauvoo, Illinois. But Smith's neighbors weren't too pleased about this upstart religion, and when Smith, then the mayor of Nauvoo, declared martial law, the state of Illinois charged him with treason. But before he could stand trial, he was shot and killed by an anti-Mormon mob that stormed the courthouse. Smith's successor was Brigham Young. Young wanted very much to lead his people beyond the borders of the United States to a place where they could practice their faith without interference and all the anti-Mormon sentiment that had been brewing in Illinois. So in 1846, Young organized a mass exodus from Nauvoo. Over 3,000 families either loaded up wagons or started walking, and took off on a 1,300-mile trek across the plains, blazing what would become known as the Mormon Trail. Young and his contingent arrived in Salt Lake Valley on July 24, 1847, after 111 days of travel. It was quite barren, nothing much to look at, but Young was convinced it was the spot and declared, "This is the right place." And so Salt Lake City was officially founded, or should I say Great Salt Lake City as it used to be called. Great Salt Lake City became the capital of Utah Territory in 1856. The name was shortened 12 years later, and then in 1896, Salt Lake City became the capital of the newly minted state of Utah. And what a choice it was, the Salt Lake Valley. It makes up a part of the Wasatch Front, a long and narrow corridor between the Wasatch Mountains to the east and the Great Salt Lake and Utah's Western Desert to the west. It had just enough water, arable land, and protection to make large-scale settlement possible. The Wasatch Mountains provided a steady source of snowmelt-fed streams, allowing for irrigation, while the alluvial soil in the valley, though dry, could be cultivated with effort. The mountains also served as a natural windbreak, shielding settlers from harsher storms, while the Great Salt Lake and Western Deserts created a natural barrier that discouraged encroachment and funneled movement through this corridor. Still though, there was work to be done. Young and the settlers immediately recognized that they needed to green up the site, and transforming the valley into a livable environment required large-scale geoengineering. It was Smith's vision on overdrive. Within days of their arrival, they started digging irrigation ditches to divert water from nearby City Creek to their crops. It was one of the first organized irrigation projects in the United States. They used these ditches to irrigate fields and grow staples like wheat, potatoes, and corn. The dry soil was eventually turned into productive farmland. The settlers also laid out a city plan based on something called the Plat of Zion. The Plat of Zion was Joseph Smith's vision for the grid layout of the city. These Roman-style grids had massive 132-foot wide streets and massive 10-acre blocks that were divided into 8 plots for one family each. These plots would have gardens and families would run businesses from their own properties. There would be no commercial or industrial zones. You can still see the remnants of Smith's vision today. The blocks in Salt Lake City are massive, at 660 feet on each side, double the size of blocks in Austin, for example, and the streets are still 132 feet wide. What the plat grid did most importantly though, was it laid the groundwork for continual and rapid expansion. I mean, look at this lithograph estimation of what the city looked like from above in 1870. That's a lot of room there for more Mormons. And to bring in more Mormons, the Church of Latter-day Saints created something called the Perpetual Immigration Fund, basically a financial lifeline for thousands of mostly poor Mormon converts who wanted to join the community in the Salt Lake Valley. The program provided loans to immigrants, enabling them to cover travel expenses. Recipients signed promissory notes to repay the assistance, often through labor or goods once they were established in Utah. The fund helped approximately 30,000 individuals from Europe and North America over its lifetime, bolstering the population of Salt Lake City and surrounding areas. These immigrants contributed vital skills and labor that supported the economic and social development of the settlement. As the fund expanded, it became central to the church's efforts to consolidate its religious community and sustain its theocratic ambitions in Utah. Speaking of ambitions, there's no one more ambitious than those who are cybercriminals and data brokers, people looking to profit off of stealing your personal information, then selling it, or even just literally release it for free. Like when in 2024, the national public data was breached and it exposed all of our most sensitive records. It was just released to whoever wanted it. And that's where I'd like to introduce the sponsor of today's video, Aura. Aura is perhaps the best all-in-one protection from identity theft, fraud, and online threats that you can find. I know for me, this is critically important, as researching videos can lead me down interesting websites, to say the least. They do all the hard work to keep you safe, identifying brokers who are selling your info, monitoring the dark web, and opting out of anything taking your information. Plus, worst comes to worst, they give up to $5 million in identity theft insurances should the unthinkable happen. There's a host of other features as well, from spam call protection, credit monitoring, parental control, to even a VPN service as well, with over 100+ virtual locations. So sign up for 2 weeks free at aura.com/versed, or by using the link in my description below to try 14 days for free. That'll be enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data is exposed. Salt Lake City's population and infrastructure were directly shaped by the influx of settlers brought through the PEF. The program introduced innovative logistical solutions, such as handcart companies and down and back wagon trains, to cut costs and transport larger groups. The fund drew some criticism though, particularly from US government officials, who viewed it as an extension of the church's control over Utah immigration and its defense of controversial practices like polygamy. By 1887, the fund was dissolved under the Edmunds-Tucker Act, an act of Congress restricting some practices of the Mormon Church. But it was still very effective in bringing people to Utah in the early years of settlement. Something else that contributed to the fact that Salt Lake City came to dominate the state of Utah is the LDS's tight centralized control. The church's centralized governance ensured that settlers arriving in the Salt Lake Valley remained tightly clustered, building a unified society rather than scattering across the frontier. Brigham Young's leadership left little room for dissent. Land allocation was organized through the church, with leaders assigning plots based on community needs and faithfulness to the church's mission. This system was as much about survival as control. By keeping the population concentrated, the church could enforce religious conformity, streamline resource use, and ensure that infrastructure, such as roads, irrigation ditches, and buildings, served the needs of the entire community. It was a vision of Zion materialized through strict oversight and planning. The church's influence extended beyond logistics to ideology. Leaders like Young preached that the valley was sacred ground, a place where the faithful could prepare for Christ's return. Spreading out would dilute this mission, leaving settlers vulnerable to external threats. The church also faced practical concerns. Utah's not-so-perfect environment made concentrated efforts critical for survival, and settlers working together had a better chance of taming the land. But do you know who else thought the ground was sacred around this region while all of this settlement was going on? The people who'd been living there for millennia. When Brigham Young said his famous, "This is the right place" line, the Great Basin was already home to some 20,000 natives, all living mostly semi-nomadic, hunter-gatherer lifestyles. Initially, interactions between the Mormons and Native Americans were mixed, oscillating between attempts at cooperation and outright conflict. Resources were scarce in the valley, and as the settlers diverted water, claimed prime farmland, and depleted local resources, tensions escalated. The Mormons, viewing the Native Americans as the Lamanites described in the Book of Mormon, people cursed but capable of redemption, approached them both as spiritual converts and as obstacles to their vision of Zion. Over the years, this relationship took a darker turn. The settlers' arrival and expansion triggered numerous violent confrontations, including massacres like the Provo River Massacre in 1850, where over 100 Timpanogos Utes were killed and many survivors were enslaved. Brigham Young's policies encouraged both proselytizing and assimilation, with Mormon families purchasing Native American children as indentured servants, seemingly to civilize them. Within 50 years of Mormon settlement, the native population of Utah had dropped by 86%. Meanwhile, the Mormon population was exploding, and Salt Lake City was about to get a lot more people than just Mormons, thanks to something called the Transcontinental Railroad. With the railroad came all kinds of people. The city was turning into more than just a Mormon Zion, and it was doing so quite rapidly. See, the railroad sparked a boom in salt manufacturing. As you can probably guess by the name, the Great Salt Lake is, well, very salty. Some parts of the lake have water that's up to 27% salt. Companies pioneered large-scale salt production by constructing evaporation ponds and refining facilities. By 1890, Utah's salt production reached 144,000 tons annually, with much of it transported via rail to supply regional silver mills and other industries. These operations were concentrated around Salt Lake City, drawing laborers and businesses to the city's expanding west side. The city's strategic location at the crossroads of the railroads and its proximity to industrial resources made it the logical center of economic activity. Between 1860 and 1870, the city's population grew from 8,200 to 12,800, driven by these new arrivals looking for work in industries like mining and manufacturing and transportation. At the same time though, by the late 1800s, settlements outside Salt Lake City were growing too. Ogden was one of them. It was actually established a year before Salt Lake City, and it's located just 35 miles north. It started growing quickly after it became a key stop along the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. The arrival of the railroad turned Ogden into a transportation and trade center, linking it to major cities across the United States. By 1890, Ogden's population had reached 15,000, and it continued to grow as industries like shipping and rail maintenance attracted workers. The construction of infrastructure, such as warehouses and rail yards, reshaped the town, making it a critical piece of Utah's economy. Despite its growth, Ogden remained tethered to the Wasatch Front corridor, benefiting from its proximity to Salt Lake City while retaining its distinct industrial identity. Then there's Provo, sitting 45 miles south of Salt Lake City, and it was developed under some pretty different circumstances. It was initially established as a Mormon agricultural settlement in the 1850s, with its early growth tied to the availability of fertile land along the Provo River and the directives of Mormon church leaders to expand agricultural production. But in 1875, Brigham Young built a school there that would eventually become Brigham Young University. By 1890, Provo's population was 6,185. The university anchored Provo's cultural and educational development, drawing students and families to the area. Together, these three cities made up and continue to make up three largest metro areas in Utah, combining of course to make the Salt Lake Provo-Ogden Combined Statistical Area, or CSA for short. They make up 82% of the state's population, with 2.8 million people. Meanwhile, if we're to look at the rest of the state, away from the Wasatch Front, most of the state is fairly inhospitable, not to mention one of the driest in the US. Most of western Utah is part of the Great Basin Desert, receiving less than 8 inches of rainfall per year. There's no reliable water sources due to the salt flats coupled with sparse vegetation. In central Utah, there's high plateaus and mountain valleys experiencing long, harsh winters and a short growing season, making large-scale settlement impractical. In eastern Utah, it's part of the Colorado Plateau, rugged, eroded, and filled with canyons, mesas, and plateaus, with extreme temperature swings between scorching hot and freezing cold, making large-scale settlement difficult. And finally, in southern Utah, the Red Rock deserts have rocky, sandy soil that can't support large-scale agriculture. It's extremely hot, and there's also frequent flash floods, to say the least. so all that's left is the Wasatch Front area. Nevertheless, when Utah became a state in 1896, Salt Lake City became its capital too, making even more people move to the area due to the fact that being a state capital means thousands of new jobs in state administrative positions open up, causing an influx of government workers and associated services. Usually, the most populous city is avoided being given the title of capital as to avoid giving it too much centralized power, and to provide a division of power between urban and rural interests, such as with Albany being the capital of New York instead of NYC, and Sacramento instead of Los Angeles in California. But this wasn't the case here. In 1908, Henry Ford rolled out the first Model T automobile and the concept of the assembly line that could mass-produce affordable cars for the masses. The country and the world would never be the same. Cars, of course, need roads, so roads were built. One particularly important one was this one, the Arrowhead Trail. It was built in the 1910s as the first all-weather road in the West, connecting Salt Lake City to Los Angeles. Stretching through deserts, mountains, and isolated communities, it was a lifeline for travelers navigating the harsh terrain of the western United States. The route followed natural pathways, cutting through Las Vegas and threading its way along the base of the Wasatch Front into Salt Lake City. The road's construction was a landmark moment in linking Utah's growing population with the booming economies of California. While rudimentary by today's standards, it opened up a crucial trade and migration corridor that continued to tie Utah's economy to larger regional markets. By 1910, Salt Lake City's population had ballooned to 131,000. In 1926, the Arrowhead Trail was incorporated into the new federal highway system and renamed US Route 91. Improvements to the road meant smoother surfaces, better signage, and consistent connections to other highways, turning Route 91 into a major artery for things like commercial freight and tourism. By the 1930s, the route was packed with vehicles transporting goods and new settlers and visitors to and from Salt Lake City. Local businesses thrived along the highway, and Provo and Ogden, smaller towns at the time, began to grow as they capitalized on the increased traffic. In the 1950s, US 91 changed to I-15 under the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 that birthed the interstate highway system. It was widened and lengthened, and the route was able to handle even more traffic as the population of the Salt Lake City metro area continued to grow. And it was growing, and growing fast. Between 1950 and 1960, the population of Salt Lake City itself nearly doubled, from 275,000 in 1950 to 400,000 in 1960. Post-World War II, the city became a hub for defense-related industries, including aerospace and manufacturing, which attracted workers and their families. Facilities like the Tooele Army Depot, about 30 miles southwest of Salt Lake City, and the Hill Air Force Base in Ogden became major employers, spurring economic and population growth in the region. The federal government invested heavily in infrastructure and defense, and job opportunities followed. Then you had the rise of suburban living. The city expanded beyond its historical boundaries as housing developments sprang up in suburban communities like Sandy, West Valley City, and Murray. Advances in transportation infrastructure, including the construction of Interstate 15, enabled people to live in suburban areas while commuting to jobs in Salt Lake City. This era also saw the rise of GI Bill-supported home ownership, especially since so many Mormons fought in World War II, making it easier for families to afford suburban homes. Suburbs offered larger houses, new amenities, and a growing middle-class lifestyle that appealed to families moving to or within the metro area. Major upgrades to Interstate 15 tied Provo, Salt Lake City, and Ogden together more closely than ever. Suburban communities like Lehi and Draper began to boom, offering affordable housing and easy access to the tech jobs clustering along the corridor. Later in the 2000s, Utah had a sort of tech boom centered around the cities of Salt Lake City and Provo, getting it the nickname of the Silicon Slopes. By 2023, the CSA population reached 2.8 million, making up 82% of Utah's total 3.4 million residents, while the Salt Lake City metro area itself was 1.25 million. But just like in places like San Francisco and Palo Alto, the quote, Silicon Slopes economic boom has come with some downsides. Housing prices have shot up at a higher rate than the national average, from around $187,000 in 2000 to nearly $561,000 in 2022. a 200% increase compared to the 162% increase nationally. Interestingly enough, maybe related to that or not, we've been now seeing areas in Utah away from the Wasatch Front rapidly growing too. For example, the city of St. George, located in the southwest, was the fastest growing metropolitan area in the nation between 2000 and 2005. Even from 2017 to 2022, it grew by 21.5%, making it the 12th fastest growing city in the nation. What's in store for the future, like the rest of the United States, remains to be seen. But as many states in the Southwest continue to rapidly grow, Utah may branch out more from the Wasatch Front, and maybe that 82% dominance will lessen over time. Thank you for watching. And again, thank you to Aura for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to sign up using the link in my description to try it for 2 weeks free. See you in the next one.